Today's focus will be on continuing on with the BEETZ model, the everyday BEETZ perspective on coaching and leading. And we'll focus on the third letter of the model, which is experimentation. So there's the first couple of components are brokering, embeddedness, and now we're on to experimentation. And I'll get at what I mean by that. Again, this is taken from work over the last number of years in a range of settings. I'm looking at coaches and other leaders and how they perform best in an everyday manner, meaning the everyday practices that they carry out. So one question to think about, if you think about your own coaching or coaches you've had, or even how you would aspire to coach, or for those of you who are more in administration or interested in other ways of leadership, how you work with coaches, you could think of a basic question, which is where do coaches get their styles? And when I say style, you can think of that in a couple of ways. You can think of that in terms of like the tactics they use, like the specific kind of on-court or on-field strategies, the plays, the system that they run. You can also think of it in more of a kind of relational way, or kind of the ways they coach, the way they treat people, the way they interact with people. So if you think about that in your own experience, you could probably bring some things to mind. I certainly can in my own experiences, and the research is pretty strong on this as well. The most powerful influence on coaches is their own coaches that they have had and or worked with in the past. It's those that they have witnessed and watched and been who they have been coached by. Again, in my cases as a coach, when I coached basketball, I drew almost directly from my college coach who I played for 4 years. The practices that I would run with my team were very much run the same way that the practices that I took part in. We used the same drills, the same plays a lot, just very much a replication of what I learned from my coach. I can even remember stories I can remember playing, again, I was a high school basketball coach, and one of my biggest rivals when I was coach was one of my former teammates. We used to play together in the team for 4 years, and then we ended up coaching rival teams in the same city. And it was always kind of funny when we played each other, because I would play his team, but his team was doing the same thing that our team was doing. We both got the same stuff from the same coach, and it was almost like having an inter squad scrimmage when we played, because we both learned from our coach. So again, think about your own coaches, how you learn to coach, how you would coach if you would think of being a coach in the future. And would you draw from your coach? Do you draw from your coach? In what ways? Both in tactics and in style, in the way you interact with others, or in one more than the other? Well, one of the challenges with this, obviously, a limitation of this, is that we can be pretty locked into a very kind of narrow way of coaching. Certainly, it's great to learn from really good coaches, but if the context in which we are working is different from the one where we learned a way of coaching, then that may be a problem. Or if we as people are different from the coaches we have had, that may be a problem. So today we're talking a little bit about one way to address that, which is experimentation, which is to say that it's really good to draw from our former coaches. It's good to draw from books that we read and clinics that we attend, and kind of a range of other sources. But it also might be worth us thinking about experimenting or trying things out in a very purposeful way. Some of the top coaches do this. I'm going to share a couple of examples that are not related immediately to coaching. This is a chart here that relates to Minot, North Dakota. And you can see years on the bottom from 2008 moving forward, and then numbers on the y-axis on the left And those numbers that you see, a big spike in the year 2012, these numbers are the numbers of children in Minot who experienced homelessness in a given year. So there's another area of my study, unrelated to athletics, relates to homelessness and poverty. So in Minot, North Dakota, we see all of a sudden something happened between 2010 and 11 and 2011-12, where they went from 61 kids who were homeless to 1,417 kids who were homeless. How is that possible? You could think about what do you think happened? How is that possible? Also in North Dakota, around the same time frame, in another area of the state called McKenzie County, we saw the same data where 0 homeless kids, 0, 0, 0. And each year, they literally had no kids who were identified as homeless in the schools, to then a rapid escalation in the years after 2012. Again, what happened? Why is it so different? You could speculate. You could think it through. I spent time in North Dakota during these periods of change, thinking about this issue with some people there, and there were actually 2 unrelated reasons for what we saw. First, in Minot, in that year 2011-12, these are pictures from overhead in Minot. That's one of the schools right here. There was these tremendous kind of historic floods that occurred in Minot, and many people lost their homes. Homes were ruined. Condos, especially trailers, a lot of lower income housing was just kind of wiped out, and a lot of children and families were left homeless. So that was the reason for that first spike. In McKenzie County, the issue is totally different. This is a picture from that area of a trailer. This is a picture from overhead in McKenzie County. What happened in McKenzie County was actually that many jobs were created. There was an oil boom in North Dakota where people were moving to the state from all over the country, even from many immigrants from Mexico were coming. There were thousands and thousands of new jobs, but there was no housing infrastructure in the state to host all these people. So, and many of these jobs were not kind of dependable long-term jobs. So it's kind of ironic. The economy was great, lots of jobs created because of the oil boom, but no housing. So all of these people were living in places like this that were sitting on the outskirts of town. So why do I share these examples? What happened in North Dakota was a new reality, one around flooding, one around an economy that changed, and people who worked in schools were called to work differently. They had to try new things. If they didn't try new things, they would be in big trouble. So that's one of the things that I worked with them on, was how do you innovate and try new things when the reality around you has changed. The same kind of logic of what happened in North Dakota you could think about in the world of sport, and again in the world of basketball, and again I'm drawing from basketball. You could think about just about any other sport. So much has changed. So even from the last 5-10 years, so much has changed in the game of basketball. You could choose the same in soccer or other sports, I'm sure, as well, that you have to think entirely differently about the way you coach in many ways. I'm not saying you need to trade in your principles or give in to your belief, shortchange your beliefs. But I'm saying some of the tactics, some of the ways, the surrounding factors have really changed. I have some pictures, just a couple of random pictures here of, one is like the youth basketball circuit is so much different now. The high-level youth basketball circuit is so much different now than it was 10 years ago. And a lot of coaches have had to change the way they recruit. They've had to change the way they even the way they coach incoming players who have been exposed to so many different things than maybe players were 15 years ago. Another picture, this is that might not make sense if you're not a basketball person, but it's a shot chart of the Houston Rockets, an NBA team, and where they take their shots from. And all the dots on the chart, you can see that, the Rockets, in fact, in this current basketball season, over 50% of their shots are coming from three-point range. Now that is a complete change. It relates to a lot of like analytics around basketball. 20 years ago in the NBA, maybe 5% of shots were from three-point range, or even less. The game has completely changed. It's another example of how coaches have to operate. They have to adapt, right? So if the way you practice, if the way you work with players is the same now as it was before these changes occurred, you might be in trouble. So again, when we ask these questions, where do coaches get their styles? Hopefully they do draw from past people, but hopefully they create space to learn and try new things as the world around them is changing. In fact, some of the changes you're seeing, like the ones I just referred to, are a result of experimentation, are a result of teams that tried new things and found that they worked. And so experimentation should not only be viewed as something that's reactive. Actually, mostly it's a proactive thing. It's a way of finding new ways of doing things to make you better. So you could call the examples that I shared, like the floods in North Dakota, as like what we call like an out of sample problem, something that we've never seen before. A lot of coaches in a lot of organizations, they continue to work the same way now as maybe they did 5 years ago or 10 years ago. They have the same routines, they have the same strategies, they have the same people, even though the world around them has changed so much. And even though that we have these out of sample, we have no experience with the things we're seeing, and yet we keep working the same way. Now, why would we expect that what worked then would work now? Why would, in the time of a changing game or a changing youth culture, why would we expect that the same strategies would work? Again, some of your basic tenets might still work, and you can still hold true to your principles of discipline and hard work and respect and all those things. But some of the things we do, if you really reflect upon what you do and how you coach or how you've been coached, you could probably question some of those and say, why does that make sense now? Why do we still do what my coach did 10 years ago? And you could probably come up with some better solutions. So the top organizations, the top coaches, the top teams, some of which you can read about in a variety of settings. You can read about in a book by Seth Davis, Getting to Us, or you can read about in a range of places in both college, the professional levels. They have cultures of innovation and experimentation. The best coaches foster that. They foster change. They foster growth in very purposeful ways. I want to share some examples of other organizations, and as I'm sharing these, think about how they may apply to your setting. So one is, if you just take note of this is a Google homepage. We're all familiar probably with the Google homepage. If you look at the bottom a little bit, you see that's from 1997, 98. So it's old, but it's recognizable in some ways. The colors that are used, the general setup of the page is familiar to a lot of us. Well, this is from 1999, a couple of years later. One aspect of Google, among many that are set up around innovation, is the way that their homepage looks. And I never really realized this until I read about it, that Google is constantly changing their front page in just very small ways, subtle ways that a lot of us might not notice. They might change a color slightly. They might change the location of a button slightly. They may reorder things very slightly, and all the time they are doing that on their front page, they're following what how user patterns change. How do people use the web page differently as we tinker with this? And sometimes there are just slight changes in the way it's oriented will bring about really big differences, and sometimes in positive ways. So they're constantly tinkering with what the website looks like in little ways, and looking for kind of where changes make positive differences. It's just one small example. So again, you could think about the design. This is a design issue. It's how a web page is designed for this major technology company. You could think about design tinkering as a coach. Like, what little elements of design could you adapt? Like, for example, where conversations are had with a team, or where certain kind of supplies or resources are located. What types of strategies are employed at different points in practice? So, that maybe you move one drill to the front end of practice, and you move another to the back end of practice, and all of a sudden you find a whole new energy with the group. These are examples of just nothing profound, small little tweaks that a lot of coaches are constantly trying. They're constantly trying, looking for little tweaks. Another example, in one area of the federal government, this has been detailed a lot. There were millions and millions of copies being made, paper copies being made in the federal government, and just wasting lots and lots and lots of paper. So one little experiment, one of the just kind of a low-level staffer suggested was that, how about every time someone wants to make a copy on one of our copy machines, we have a little button pop up on the copy machine asking if you want to make a two-sided copy instead of a one-sided copy. Just a small thing, and someone could easily write no on there, click no, yes or no. Well, what happened with that small little experiment was that there was about just like a 5% change, like 5% of the people 5% more started doing two-sided copies. But in a time when there were hundreds and hundreds of millions of copies being made, they saved literally millions of pages of paper. It's a small example of a little tiny tweak that had a huge impact. A couple of other examples relating to taxes. One was that a lot of people who don't pay taxes for a lot of years were given a mailing, like a mailing would come and said, reminding them they had to pay their taxes, and there was a penalty to be paid. It was a really expensive thing for the government to follow up on every one of these cases where people didn't pay their taxes. Another was people were underreporting on their taxes, their income. They were paying less tax than they should have been paid, both of which were very expensive for the government, lots of losses. So two little experiments that were played out. One was that instead of doing mailings, the users would just get a quick text, a short text that said, remember to submit your taxes. So it was very cheap, very easy for the government to do. And as a result of the texts were 40% more effective than in terms of getting a response than the paper reminders. So it was a big success, and it's cheaper, more effective, a little tweak. The other, with the underreporting of taxes, some people filing tax returns were given a simple clause at the beginning of their tax return. It said, do you promise to tell the truth? Just, you had to check a box if you would tell the truth on your taxes. Seems very silly. But on just that little one sentence in a box that said, yes, I promise to tell the truth, resulted in millions of dollars more in taxes being paid to the government. People actually were more honest when they said they would be honest. Again, just silly, kind of not silly, but just minor tweaks that were tried. There are many other experiments by these groups that didn't work, that these are just some of the successful ones. But they're examples in kind of large and huge organizations. You could call these nudges also, little nudges, little tweaks that are aimed at changing behavior among the people that work in them or that work with them. So we could think in the same way about little nudges, little tweaks that could change behavior in our teams. And what would those nudges be? What would those little tweaks be? How would you experiment? How would you innovate? Sometimes those are around like the way people interact with each other. Sometimes they're like around strategy. So some of you may have heard of this football coach named Kevin Kelly, who became famous high school football coach in Arkansas. He became famous because he would never punt. His team on fourth down, no matter where they were, they would never punt. They went for it on fourth down every time, which seems crazy if you follow football at all. But his teams actually ended up being super successful, not just because of that, but he was very successful at that. And he had simple reasons. One is that most high school punters aren't very good at punting the ball, so they weren't getting much of a return. Maybe a net 20-yard, net 20 to 25 yards in the punt. And so the loss in potential field position was offset by the number of times they converted a first down on fourth down. And anyway, he became well known for that little experiment. He tried other experiments also, some of which did not work, but that one ended up working really, really well, and his team became really successful, and a lot of people tried to adapt his strategy. It's an example of a kind of a tactical or strategic experimentation that we could also think about in our own places. Sometimes it's hard to do that in coaching. Like if it's easier for a high school coach in Arkansas to try some kind of radical experiment like that than it is if you're the head coach at the University of Wisconsin, where you have thousands of people watching you and media and everything. It's much harder to try more radical experiment. But there are all kinds of more subtle experiments that can occur in practice, in the way we train, and ultimately maybe sometimes in game type strategy. Another example of a little more of a kind of behavioral tweak. Again, I'll refer again to something occurring at Stanford, which is a place that is really rooted in innovation, even in their athletic department. This is a picture in their weight room, picture that I took in the strength coach's office, of a bunch of binders. Those are just simple 3-ring binders there, and you can't really see the names on the binders, but every time a new football player comes into Stanford, the strength coach or the coaches will sit down with that new person and say, well, what do you want to be? Like, what do you hope for in the next 4 years? And they ask the incoming players to identify a past player that they admire and that they want to be like. So, for example, there was a famous quarterback at Stanford and now is in the NFL, Andrew Luck. Andrew Luck is a well-known NFL quarterback. And there's one binder on this shelf that I looked at. It's Andrew Luck's binder. And what that is when Andrew Luck was at Stanford, every day the coaches would have Andrew kind of document what workout he did, and then on like a weekly basis or a regular basis, he would do almost like a little journal entry about how's it going. Like, I'm struggling with this exercise, or this is really hard. Or so you can look at his own handwriting. He's got these regular reflections that went on for his 4 years there at Stanford. So the experiment they tried was, they said, okay, we now, it could be 10 years later, we have this young 18-year-old coming in and says he wants to be like Andrew Luck. I want to have a career like that. And so the experiment was to say, okay, well, you want to be like him? And they pull out his binder and they say, every day you're going to read what he was going through when he was your age. So when he was 18, this is what he did on September 15th. And this is the workout he did, and this is what he was struggling with. These are the growths that he made. This is the progress he made in a very concrete fashion. They are saying they're making aspirations concrete. They're showing a newcomer to the program literally what the person that they look up to did and what he thought about while he was doing it. It's a pretty cool experiment, and one that's kind of rendered great results there in terms of making aspirations, as I said, concrete, and holding holding team members accountable to what they aspire toward, not just saying what they want, but showing them that the people that they looked up to paid a price and went through certain things, and encouraging them to engage in that challenge. They've even gone beyond that to actually, a lot of these people whose names are on these binders, these are successful players from the past. They actually come to the campus over the summer and throughout the year to then actually sit down and talk with the people who aspire to be like them. So it's a real time and an actual concrete type of cross-generational mentoring, and it's an experiment that I've found to be pretty interesting. So experimenting, just to kind of close up, experimenting as a coach in terms of the BEETZ model, an everyday thing. It's not like, okay, we're going to choose one experiment we're going to try this year. It's kind of a relentless, like an ongoing, always looking for new ideas. And I'm not, again, let me be clear, I'm not saying always starting over and always changing everything. Not at all. I'm saying within our consistent framework of beliefs and principles and ideals, where are the areas where we can look to tweak? Where are the areas we can nudge people to try new things? And it's in a leadership that is kind of what I call a can-do, like, yes, open to new ideas, inviting of new ideas, and there's a bit of humility here in it, saying that I don't know everything. I may have been coaching for 30 years, but I need to still learn. And we can do something new. We can try new things. It's an openness to that. It's an everyday development type of perspective. So every day we're trying to innovate. Every day we're open to it. So the best coaches I've worked with, the best coaches I've studied, the best leaders in other organizations, whether it's these kind of school leaders I worked with when they were engaging in floods in North Dakota, or coaches of NBA programs or of college programs, are those that are open to trying new things, to experimenting. So you can ask yourself a couple of questions. How does your team or organization foster experimentation? How do you encourage it? And then an important part of this is that many experiments will not work. A lot of them, we have to find ways to experiment that will not kind of undercut our core work. These have to, in some ways, be kind of low-risk experiments in a lot of ways, things that you can do kind of on the periphery of your work. So we need to not only learn how to try new things, but how to kind of monitor them, evaluate them, and recognize that even if very small changes are taking place, those can ultimately make a big difference. So many of the examples I shared with you were not like dramatic in their impact right away. They were over the long haul. Behavior changed. Over the long haul, perspectives changed. Over the long haul, improvements were made. So that we'd call those kind of the compounding effects of small gains. How do we recognize those things? So this is what experimentation is about in the BEETZ model. And I encourage you to really kind of reflect upon your own experiences around innovation and experimentation, and to think about how you could actually do even better in this area.